One of the most shocking things I've seen this year is the overall drop-off from the top teams in the NBA to the worst teams and the bottom feeders in both conferences. And look, like in past years in 2016, 2017, you had clear championship favorites and what some would call super teams. Nowadays, there's not really a dominant championship team that is the clear favorite, but what we do have now are just completely decimated teams that are absolutely abysmal. And at this point, we have not one, not two, but three historically bad teams in this year alone. As right now the Pistons are 2-25, having lost 23 straight games, the Wizards 4-22, having lost 16 straight at one point, the Spurs also 4-22, having lost 18 games straight at one point in this season. If you look at the 10 worst teams in NBA history based off win percentage, all three of those teams would crack the top 10. And looking at that list, pretty important note, no other year has more than one team in that top 10 for the worst teams ever. I think those facts right there are pretty damning with the modern NBA and level of competition. And why I wanted to bring this up is because Shannon Sharpe for close to 4 or 5 years has been pushing this age-old myth that Michael Jordan played in the expansion era with watered-down teams. Now, what I find funny about this argument, when it comes to Jordan's era, they'll bash it 24/7. But when it comes to 2010s, LeBron's era, even the 2020s, they'll overlook numerous bad teams who were tanking on purpose to get draft picks. I mean, Shannon Sharpe, not once in his career, will mention the Bobcats, who won 7 games. The Trust the Process 76ers, the biggest tank job ever pulled in NBA history, and for 3 straight years, we're just completely packing it in, playing multiple 25-plus game losing streaks, including the longest of all time at 28 games. And look, to be objective, the 1990s, late 1980s had some pretty bad bottom-feeding teams. But the difference is, those bottom-feeding teams, they weren't tanking on purpose, losing games, and throwing games to get draft picks. And virtually all those franchises, in 2, 3, 4 years, were in the playoffs and competing deep in the postseason. I mean, look at the Charlotte Hornets, one of the lesser expansion teams, had Alonzo Mourning, Larry Johnson, Muggsy Bogues, had won 50 games, 51, and 97 with Glenn Rice, won 54. Those 90s Hornets teams still are the best teams in Charlotte's history. Look at the Miami Heat, also an expansion team. By 97, had won 61 games, made the East Finals, 98, 55, and 99 lockout year, won a 55-win pace. And looking at Heat history, only LeBron's Heat in 2013 won more games than the 97 Heat. And that overall roster, it was stacked with Tim Hardaway, Alonzo, Jamal Mashburn, Thunder Dan, and Hall of Fame coach Pat Riley. Now, last but not least, the Orlando Magic, debatably the most successful expansion team. As Orlando, they won 50-plus games 3 straight years in the 90s with Shaq, Penny, Nick Anderson, Horace Grant, and 3D. And most notably, made the finals in 95 and 96, won 60 games, a franchise best. What I'm trying to show you guys, that Jordan playing the expansion era, it wasn't watered down nearly as much as you think it was, as those so-called expansion teams were competing for championships, competing for playoff spots pretty early on. And if you look at the top 10 worst teams of all time once again, 6 of the top 10 played in LeBron James' era, and out of the top 4, you have 3 of them. Shannon Sharpe conveniently never brings this stuff up when talking about Jordan and his watered-down era in the 1990s. As if you apply that same logic to LeBron James, he looks even worse. And if you want to expand that list even further, look at the top 50 worst records of all time. 13 teams were active when Michael Jordan was playing, compared to LeBron James, where you have 19. It seems like any Shannon Sharpe criticism of Jordan can be applied to LeBron James even more so. And if you don't want to talk the worst competition, look at both these guys and their best competition, that being Jordan's East and LeBron's East. As the majority of their championship runs, both Jordan and LeBron, their path to the finals, went through that conference. Now, looking at Jordan, in his Eastern Conference, there were 7 teams who won 60-plus games, and 15 of them won 55-plus. compared to LeBron James, with only 16 teams that won 60 games and 9 teams that won 55. So again, comparing Jordan's comp versus LeBron's comp in both their Eastern Conferences, Michael Jordan's bottom-feeding teams weren't nearly as bad as LeBron's, and his top-tier competition was better in his own conference. And if you look at LeBron's championship runs to the NBA Finals, the best team he beat en route to the Finals was the Raptors in 2016. That Raptors team didn't crack 60 wins. Now, looking at Jordan's 6 championships, again, all in the Eastern Conference, he beat not 1, not 2, but 3 60-win teams and 3 more teams that won more games than the 2016 Raptors. Major LeBron fans, people like Shannon and Sharpe, absolutely love to bash Jordan's competition. But comparing him versus LeBron James straight up, it's not even a conversation or a debate worth having. And again, looking at 2024, even with the added in planned tournament and season tournament, I would say roughly 4 to 7 teams already have quit and packed it in for the 2024 season. And I think in large part of teams quitting, giving up, stats nowadays are becoming easier and easier. And looking at the worst defensive teams in NBA history who allow the most points, here's your top 15. At number 1, the 91 Nuggets, who'll still rank first all time at an astounding 131 points allowed per game. That's atrocious. But look down the list. There is 7 teams in the top 15 from 2024 alone. Denver back then was the outlier, the outcast. They went all in on offense and couldn't care about defense. But nowadays, roughly half NBA teams have that strategy and that overall motivation. And one of the most damning stats of all, the 2017 Warriors, who played less than a decade ago, one of the best teams of all time, one of the best offensive teams ever. If you put their offensive rating in today's NBA, they wouldn't even be top 15. Now, why is that? Have teams gotten drastically better? Are there 15 squads better than that Warriors team offensively? Of course not. What's happened? Defense has been so demoted, so demoralized. You have teams like the Indiana Pacers just racking up historic stats with only 1 All-Star. Those numbers right there are a damning indictment on today's NBA and the defense. And I'm sorry to say it, but the overall expansion era myth, it pales in comparison to the defense today being so awful, and teams like the Spurs, Pistons, Wizards being historically bad. So that right there is the end of the video. As always, thank you guys for watching, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.